On the night Lena Hart vanished, the campus felt ordinary in the way familiar places do when nothing seems wrong. Quiet sidewalks, scattered leaves drifting under the yellow glow of old street lamps, and a chill that hinted at the first real weeks of fall. Students moved in small clusters toward dorms and dining halls, slipping into the rhythm of mid-semester exhaustion. For most people, it was an unremarkable Tuesday night. For Lena, it was supposed to be just another late study session before midterms. Nothing more. She left her dorm at 8:19 p.m., according to the building's entry logs. She wore a soft gray hoodie, a black canvas backpack, hair pulled back loosely like she didn't have the energy to deal with it. She told her roommate she'd only be gone for a few hours. "I just need to finish this paper," she said, the kind of promise countless students make before heading into the quiet isolation of their campus library. There was no tension in her voice, no sign of fear, no hint that these were the last words anyone would hear her say. The university library sat at the northwest edge of campus, an aging structure of concrete and glass that always felt colder inside than out. At 8:43 p.m., a grainy overhead CCTV camera captured her walking through its front entrance. She pushed the door with her shoulder the way she always had, juggling the strap of her backpack. The footage shows her brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, glancing briefly toward the reference desk, then stepping out of frame. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw her alive. Lena wasn't the type to disappear. Friends later described her as calm under pressure, focused, and responsible almost to a fault. She was a second-year psychology student, known for color-coded notebooks and late-night study habits. She had been stressed. Sure, midterms always did that to her, but nothing unusual enough to raise alarms. She didn't have a history of mental health issues, didn't use drugs, didn't have sudden mood changes, didn't fight with friends or professors. Her life was steady, predictable, almost frustratingly normal. When she failed to return to her dorm that night, no one noticed at first. College campuses are full of unpredictable schedules and long nights. Her roommate assumed she stayed at the library until closing. The next morning, when her bed was still untouched and her phone remained on silent, her absence began to stretch into something that didn't feel like a typical late-night study binge. By noon, friends were texting her. Messages went unread. Calls went straight to voicemail. That uneasy feeling, the kind that grows slow and quiet in the background, finally settled in. Her roommate walked to the library to look for her, half expecting to find Lena asleep at a desk or huddled in a corner over her laptop. Instead, she found nothing. No Lena, no laptop, no sign she had ever been there, aside from what the cameras confirmed. At 4:52 p.m., campus security called the non-emergency police line, reporting a student who hadn't been seen in nearly 20 hours. The responding officers treated it as routine. College-aged adults disappear all the time, willingly or otherwise. Sometimes it's stress, sometimes it's impulsive travel, sometimes it's the simple desire to vanish for a day or two. Police didn't immediately consider foul play. They asked the standard questions. Did she ever talk about leaving? Did she have family problems? Was she depressed or unstable? Every answer pushed the case further toward confusion. That evening, detectives reviewed the library's internal cameras. Most of them were ancient, low-resolution, often blurry, and prone to glitching. The footage clearly showed Lena walking in, but not a single camera showed her walking out. At first, investigators assumed she left through a blind spot, one of many in the outdated system. Students slipped through them all the time without being recorded. But when police searched the building room by room, floor by floor, they found something that changed the tone of the investigation instantly. On the second floor, at a desk tucked beneath a row of dusty academic journals, Lena's black backpack sat upright on a chair, neatly placed, not tossed or forgotten. The zippers were closed. Her notebooks were stacked inside, her pens clipped in their usual spots, her water bottle half full. Everything was arranged in a way that didn't suggest panic or sudden flight. It looked like she had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. Detectives later described it as too perfect, an arrangement that didn't fit the narrative of someone walking out willingly. Her phone, laptop, and ID were all missing. The authoritative tone of the officers shifted. People who vanish temporarily don't leave behind the belongings they carry everywhere. By the next morning, Lena was officially listed as a missing person. Police interviewed everyone who saw her that night. A student on the second floor remembered seeing her around 9:30 p.m., typing quickly on her laptop. Another thought they passed her near the restroom. None of these sightings were confirmed on camera. The library's interior footage had several unexplained gaps, sections of corrupted video that covered exactly the hours investigators needed. The system hadn't been updated in years, so malfunctions weren't rare, but these particular gaps felt almost suspiciously precise. As detectives pressed further, they learned more about Lena's state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance. Friends said she had been tired, overwhelmed with exams, but she wasn't behaving irrationally. She hadn't withdrawn socially. She hadn't talked about danger or fear or wanting to escape. Nothing pointed to self-harm or desperation. Her last texts to friends were about study notes and weekend plans. One of her professors later shared that she had turned in a thoughtful, well-written essay the morning before she vanished. There was no sign of mental instability, no signal that she was running from anything, and yet she was gone. Rumors began spreading through campus like wildfire, students whispering about hidden floors in the library, old tunnels, faculty scandals, stalkers, strange noises at night. Most of it was typical college gossip, but some of it hinted at real structural oddities in the aging building. Investigators checked maintenance routes, emergency exits, and staff-only corridors. Nothing unusual surfaced. As hours turned into days, police expanded the search beyond campus. They combed nearby woods, drainage tunnels, and abandoned service structures. K-9 units tracked her scent only up to the library entrance, then lost it completely inside. It was as if she had been swallowed by the building itself. That unsettling detail became a quiet obsession for detectives. How could someone walk into a library and vanish without leaving a trace? There was no sign of forced exit, no broken locks, no shattered glass. Nothing disturbed. The place remained eerily untouched. Whenever investigators returned to the second-floor desk, they described the same uneasy feeling that her belongings felt staged, deliberately placed, almost arranged for discovery. But if someone wanted to hide her disappearance, why leave anything behind? Why not take the backpack too? Why make it look so intentional? Within 3 days, Lena's parents arrived on campus, exhausted, frightened, and desperately clinging to hope. Her mother walked the library floors with police, staring at the empty desk where her daughter had last Saturday. She whispered, "She wouldn't leave her things. She wouldn't leave without telling someone." The detectives didn't disagree. Despite the growing concern, the case lacked hard evidence. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses who saw her leave, no trail to follow. And the longer she remained missing, the harder it became to believe she'd simply walked away. The press caught wind of the story. Headlines framed it as a mysterious disappearance, a promising student who vanished from a secure academic building. With every passing day, tension on campus grew. Students gathered for vigils. Professors pleaded for information. Yet the investigation continued to circle the same unresolved timeline. Everything in the case pointed to the moment she stepped into the library. Everything after that was a void. The truth was out there somewhere, buried in corrupted footage, forgotten corners of an aging building, or in the memories of someone who hadn't yet come forward. And as police began methodically pulling apart the final hours before she vanished, one unsettling question lingered louder than all the others. If Lena didn't walk out of that library, then where did she go? And who already knew the answer? The first 72 hours of any missing person investigation are the ones detectives depend on most. But for Lena's case, those hours dissolved quickly into confusion. The initial momentum that carried investigators through the early search soon began to feel misplaced, like they were following a trail that had never existed in the first place. Every answer they uncovered created 2 new questions. Every lead collapsed just as they began to lean on it, and the building where she was last seen, the library, started to feel less like the backdrop of a disappearance and more like the center of something that had been quietly wrong for a long time. Detectives spent their first full week interviewing students who claimed to have seen her that night. At first, witnesses seemed confident. A sophomore said he passed her near the third-floor stairwell sometime around midnight. A graduate student insisted she saw Lena at a study table around 12:30 a.m., head down, typing intensely. Another person claimed they saw her waiting near the elevators shortly after 1 a.m., as if she were preparing to leave. But when investigators compared each account with time-stamped camera footage, schedules, and badge entry logs, the stories fell apart. One witness had been studying in a dorm lounge that night and couldn't have been anywhere near the library. Another left campus hours before the time they swore they saw her. A third mixed up dates entirely. What looked like helpful information at first became a tangle of contradictions that wasted valuable time. The inconsistencies weren't unusual. Memory under stress could become unreliable, but the pattern suggested something more unsettling. People insisted they'd seen Lena long after she was believed to have vanished, yet none of their descriptions matched one another. In some accounts, she carried her backpack. In others, she didn't. Sometimes she appeared calm. In other versions, she looked distressed. The sightings blurred together, leaving detectives with nothing solid enough to use. As investigators shifted their attention back to the building itself, the frustration only deepened. The library's outdated security system offered little clarity. Several cameras on the second and third floors displayed corrupted footage exactly during the hours Lena supposedly moved through the building. Entire segments were missing, glitching, freezing, or going black for minutes at a time. Detectives initially believed the gaps were accidental, caused by the old system, but the timing was too precise to ignore. Footage leading up to 11:58 p.m. was intact. Footage after 2:07 a.m. was intact. Everything in between the period when witnesses claimed to have seen her was simply gone. Technicians inspected the servers, searching for signs of tampering. They found nothing conclusive, no forced access, no overwritten logs, no malware. Just unexplained corruption in a system that had been failing for years. It wasn't impossible, but it was odd, almost deliberate in its convenience. Without visual proof of her movements, detectives were left with a strange contradiction. The last confirmed image of Lena existed at 8:43 p.m., yet several people swore they saw her much later. Without footage to counter or confirm those claims, the timeline dissolved into uncertainty. When search dogs were brought into the library, investigators hoped scent tracking would succeed where technology failed. The dogs were trained for urban searches, capable of following human traces through buildings, stairwells, and crowded hallways. Handlers started them at the front entrance, using clothing from Lena's dorm to tune their scent. The dogs moved with purpose at first, pulling their leads toward the second floor. They circled the area near the desk where her backpack was found, noses close to the carpet, moving in tight, focused loops. But then something strange happened. The trail didn't continue toward the exits, bathrooms, or stairwells. It didn't lead outside. It didn't lead anywhere at all. The scent simply stopped inside the library. Handlers tried again. Same result. The dogs followed her path into the building and lost it near her study desk, as if she had never walked beyond that point. It was rare for a scent to end abruptly indoors unless the person had been carried, concealed, or removed in a way that masked their trail. Detectives exchanged glances, acknowledging the same thought but not speaking it aloud. If Lena had left the library, she didn't walk out on her own feet. Once the K-9 results leaked, the rumors started. Students whispered about old architectural plans, stories passed down by staff and alumni about a forgotten area beneath the library. Some claimed it was a storage floor sealed off decades ago. Others called it a maintenance level or an unfinished basement. A few swore it was once intended as an expansion that never materialized, a place abandoned before it was ever used. None of these stories had proof, just fragments of campus lore resurfacing in the wake of fear. When detectives questioned university administrators, they were met with uncomfortable smiles and firm denials. There was no hidden level beneath the library, they said. No sealed-off space, no locked rooms, no forgotten corridors. The structure was exactly as the public saw it. But several investigators noticed the evasiveness in tone, the slight hesitation before answering, the quick exchanges between staff members, the way their eyes drifted to one another before offering the official response. It wasn't outright dishonesty, but something about it didn't feel clean. Detectives requested building blueprints. The facilities department provided them copies from the 1,990 seconds, when the library underwent its last renovation. But when investigators cross-referenced the structural diagrams with older city records, they noticed subtle inconsistencies. Small rooms marked decades earlier no longer appeared in the newer plans. Narrow maintenance shafts had been erased. A large rectangular space beneath the foundation, a space listed as storage, was nowhere to be found in the documents the university claimed were final. When confronted with these discrepancies, administrators insisted the older blueprints reflected proposals, not finished construction. They said revisions were common. They said no part of the building was hidden or inaccessible. But detectives weren't convinced. Something was missing, not just Lena, but pieces of the library's history itself. As days passed, public interest in the case surged. Students held nightly gatherings inside the library, forming study groups near the second floor where her backpack had been recovered, as if being close to the last trace of her anchored them to her story. Flyers with her photo-covered bulletin boards. Strangers who'd never met her cried during candlelight vigils. Her parents remained on campus, exhausted but determined, walking the paths she once took, retracing her last known steps while detectives moved deeper into the administrative maze that controlled access to old records. By the end of the second week, leads were slipping through the investigators' fingers. No new sightings, no suspicious activity, no evidence of a struggle. The grainy camera footage yielded nothing. Search teams combed every wooded area within a mile of campus with no results. Even the whispers of a hidden level lost traction as officials repeatedly denied its existence. It became harder to separate rumor from possibility. Detectives began reevaluating theories. If Lena had left the library on her own, she should have appeared on at least one camera facing the exits or paths leading away from the building. If she left with someone else, there should have been signs, disturbances, captured silhouettes, unusual activity. But there were none. If someone harmed her within the building, they left no visible trace. No blood, no damage, no physical evidence. Everything about the environment felt scrubbed clean long before anyone suspected a crime. As the third week approached, tensions between the university and Lena's family grew. Her mother begged administrators to release older construction records, internal security logs, anything that might help. Her father pleaded with detectives not to give up, insisting they hadn't looked in the right places. The family began posting on social media, urging students to come forward anonymously if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Messages poured in. Most were theories, stories, or frightened speculation. None were usable. Eventually, the investigation slowed until it barely moved. Without new leads, police shifted their focus to routine rechecks of known information, hoping something small had been overlooked. But every document, interview, and search route led back to the same fixed point, the second-floor desk where her backpack sat untouched, as if someone wanted it to be found. By the end of the month, the official status of the case quietly changed. What began as an urgent missing person search became a dormant file in the department's system. Detectives remained assigned, but the active man-hours dwindled. Lena's posters faded in the Sunday. Students stopped gathering at the library. Rumors softened into campus legend. And slowly, the silence that follows unresolved disappearances settled into place. But even as the investigation froze, a single question refused to fade. If the library had nothing to hide, why did every path that led to the truth seem sealed shut? And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, someone still knew more than they had ever told. 7 years is a long time for a family to live inside the same unanswered question. For the Hart family, those years settled into their lives in a way that felt heavier with each passing season. What began as frantic hope in the days after Lena vanished gradually reshaped itself into a quiet, grinding endurance, one that left them suspended between grief and expectation, never knowing which direction to lean. Every morning they woke with the same unspoken thought. Maybe today something would change. And every night they returned to the same silence. In the first year, her parents refused to leave campus, staying in a small rental apartment nearby. They walked the same paths Lena once took, tracing the route from her dorm to the library, with the devotion of people trying to feel the presence of someone who no longer left footprints. Vigils were held monthly at first, organized by classmates and faculty who lit candles along the stone courtyard and spoke softly about her kindness, her academic goals, the life she had been building. Those gatherings gave her family something to hold on to, proof that she was not forgotten, that the community still cared. But as time passed, the vigils became less frequent. Students graduated, new faces replaced old ones. The urgency of the search faded behind fresher campus headlines. Each year, the turnout shrank, not out of indifference, but because the weight of time naturally pushed the story into memory rather than the present. By the third year, the vigil had become an annual event, quiet, respectful, but no longer filled with the raw, collective desperation that once surrounded her disappearance. It became a ritual more than a rally, a way to honor a girl most of the attendees had never met. The Hart family refused to let the case turn into a symbol. They pressed detectives for updates, attended every meeting they were allowed into, and pleaded with the university to review their security policies, hoping that something, anything, might spark new attention. But the investigation moved slowly. Assigned detectives transferred divisions or retired. The case file was passed from desk to desk, each new investigator reopening the same binders, reading the same interviews, and reaching the same dead end inside the library walls. Without new evidence, their efforts felt like tracing the shape of a locked door they couldn't open. Over the years, amateur sleuths filled the void left by official silence. Online forums dissected every known detail of the case. The corrupted footage, the scent trail ending indoors, the inconsistencies in witness reports. Theories multiplied. Some insisted the university was hiding a structural flaw or secret room. Others believed Lena had been targeted by someone on campus, a professor, a fellow student, a stranger who slipped inside unnoticed. A few insisted she staged her disappearance, though nothing about her life supported that idea. Most theories burned out quickly, replaced by new ones, each promising answers that never came. Her family followed these discussions at first, hoping for a lead overlooked by authorities, but eventually the speculation became painful. The more time passed, the more distorted the story became, mixed with rumors, exaggerations, and guesses from people who had never set foot on campus. Meanwhile, the campus itself changed in ways that made the investigation even harder to revisit. The university was expanding rapidly, driven by increasing enrollment and generous alumni donations. New laboratories were built, dorms were modernized, entire wings of older academic buildings were renovated, repainted, redirected. Even the library underwent significant upgrades. Platforms of scaffolding wrapped around the structure during summers, workers pouring new concrete, installing new electrical systems, replacing floors, sealing off old maintenance corridors. Officials framed these changes as progress. But for investigators who revisited the case years later, the expansion represented a quiet destruction of potential evidence. Hallways where Lena may have walked were remodeled. Rooms where workers once stored outdated equipment were repurposed or sealed. The lines between what existed during her disappearance and what stood in its place now blurred with every renovation. For the Hart family, each construction project felt like watching parts of her story disappear. Her mother often stood across from the library, staring up at the new facade as if trying to recognize the building her daughter had entered. The subtle changes unsettled her: new windows, brighter lighting, the removal of old shelving she remembered seeing on news reports from the early investigation. She told friends that the more the campus evolved, the harder it became to picture the last night of Lena's life. Grief is cruel that way. It doesn't just cling to the memory of a person, it clings to the places they touched. By the 5th year, Lena's case had become something students whispered about during freshman orientation. The mystery of the girl who vanished without a trace turned into a cautionary tale shared in dorm hallways and late-night study sessions. Some believed the story was exaggerated. Others treated it like a haunting urban legend. Most knew bits and pieces, but few understood the depth of loss behind it. Her family watched the story slowly detach from the truth, reshaped by distance and time. Through all of this, one person remained a constant presence inside the library: Harold Finch, a reclusive night shift janitor who had worked there long before Lena disappeared and continued long after the case went cold. Harold was the kind of man most people overlooked, a quiet figure moving through the building with a mop cart, pushing doors open with his shoulder, keeping to the edges of hallways. Students rarely acknowledged him, and he seemed perfectly comfortable being invisible. For years he watched as the library transformed, new carpets rolled in, old tiles ripped out, bookcases relocated, lighting systems replaced. Every change passed through his hands before it passed through anyone else's. Though Harold never spoke publicly about the disappearance, something in him shifted that night 7 years earlier. People who worked alongside him said he became quieter, keeping his eyes down, taking longer routes through the stacks, as if avoiding certain corners of the building. Sometimes he paused near the spot where Lena's backpack had been found, staring at the empty desk with a distant, troubled expression. But when asked about it, he always shrugged, saying he was just tired. He never volunteered more, and no one pressed him. Janitors rarely became part of the narrative, even when they lived at the edges of every story. Harold watched the investigation unfold from the periphery, sweeping floors while detectives questioned librarians, collecting trash as officers reviewed camera angles, wiping tables while search dogs sniffed stairwells. He saw the panic, the urgency, the hope, the whole storm of emotions surrounding the early days, and he watched the slow erosion that followed. The way investigators' visits became more infrequent, the way students stopped asking questions, the way Lena's name shifted from a rallying cry to something almost mythic. More than anyone, he witnessed the decay of attention. He watched posters taken down to make space for new announcements. He listened as incoming students whispered inaccurate versions of the story while studying late at night. He overheard administrators speak about the disappearance in hushed tones, as if trying to distance themselves from the building's past. And every night, as the library emptied and quiet settled back into its walls, Harold remained behind, pushing his cart down the same halls where her scent once dissolved. Time did what it always does, it allowed people to move on. But Harold didn't. Something tethered him to the memory of that night, something he never voiced aloud. He carried it silently, like a weight that grew heavier each year. He continued working the night shift, watching the clock strike 8:43 p.m., and then pass into the hours when she should have still been alive inside the library. He never forgot the strange stillness of that night, even as everyone else tried to forget the uncertainty it left behind. 7 years after Lena Hart vanished, the campus barely resembled the one she last walked through. New freshmen passed through the library doors without knowing the history beneath their feet. Staff changed. Policies changed. Structures changed. Even the lighting felt different, brighter, cleaner, stripped of the dim corners that once fueled rumor. But Harold remained. He was the only thread connecting the present to the night she disappeared, the only person who had witnessed the campus evolve while carrying the unresolved truth quietly inside him. And then, one evening near the end of that 7th year, something shifted. A small, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the silence that had surrounded the case for so long. It started with a question Harold could no longer push down, a memory that resurfaced with enough force to shake the routine he had buried himself in. And for the first time in years, the story of Lena Hart's disappearance began to stir again, because the one man who had stayed silent the longest was finally starting to wonder how much longer he could keep what he knew to himself. Harold Finch had never been the kind of man anyone noticed. For nearly 3 decades, he pushed his cart down the same waxed hallways, emptied the same trash bins, and swept the same corners of the university library without ever drawing attention to himself. Students came and went, semesters changed, the campus grew louder and more modern around him. But Harold remained exactly where he had always been, quiet, unnoticed, and deliberately forgettable. It was a role he took comfort in, and one he protected carefully. But 7 years after Lena Hart vanished, the quiet man who had spent most of his life trying not to be seen reached a point where silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like guilt. And guilt had a way of aging a person faster than time. When he placed the call to the cold case division, his voice shook just enough that the detective on the other end asked him to repeat himself. He told them he was retired now, that he had worked as a custodian at the Addison University Library for most of his life, and that he wanted to talk about the night Lena disappeared. There was a long pause before the detective responded, because it was the kind of statement that had become almost mythical over the years. Dozens of tips had come and gone, most of them rooted in rumor or desperation. But something in Harold's tone sounded different. He wasn't guessing, and he wasn't speculating. He was remembering. When he walked into the precinct 2 days later, the detectives were struck by how nervous he was. His hands shook even when he held them against his sides, and his posture curled slightly inward, as if bracing against something only he could feel. He didn't look like someone finally ready to unburden himself. He looked like someone about to relive a moment he'd spent years trying to forget. Harold began with the details he thought mattered, least his schedule, his routine, the hours he normally worked. He always clocked in at 4 p.m. and clocked out at midnight. But on the night Lena vanished, he stayed late. A supervisor had asked him to strip and re-wax the basement corridors, a job that took longer than he expected. He remembered the smell of the chemicals lingering in the air, the hum of the old ventilation system, and the empty stillness of a building after the last students had left. It was a kind of quiet he had grown used to over the years, a comforting quiet. But that night, he said, something about the silence felt uneasy. The detectives listened without interrupting. Harold moved slowly, as if every sentence needed permission to leave his mouth. Then he stopped, avoiding the part he had come to tell. He said he heard a sound soft, muffled, and sharp enough to cut through the thick emptiness of the basement level. It was short, almost swallowed by the old concrete walls, but he felt something instinctual in his body react to it, like it wasn't a normal sound to hear in a place like that. He said it reminded him of someone trying to speak through a hand pressed tightly over their mouth. He walked toward it. Not quickly, he never moved quickly, but with a cautious, hesitant pace. The sound came from near a section of the basement almost no one used anymore. The old maintenance corridor had been sealed years earlier after new construction rerouted the electrical systems. The door to that corridor was always locked, always blocked, and never discussed. Harold had passed it countless times. He had never heard anything behind it. When the detectives asked him to clarify the sound, Harold leaned back and looked at the wall as if the memory were projected there. He said it wasn't repeated, not exactly. It was a single burst of panic that ended abruptly, like someone had been startled, restrained, or silenced. He didn't know. He couldn't know. But the second he heard it, something in him froze. He continued, telling them he reached the corridor entrance around the same time someone else came into view. A man he recognized instantly. Dr. Marcus Greer, tenured faculty member, well-respected, known for his work in behavioral science. Harold had cleaned the man's office for years. He knew his habits, his schedule, his voice, and on that night, he saw him doing something that made no sense. Greer was standing a short distance from the sealed maintenance door, breathing heavily, adjusting his grip on something large and slumped over his shoulder. Harold emphasized how strange it looked, a human-shaped weight wrapped tightly in one of the gray custodial blankets from the supply rooms, the same blankets used to cover furniture during maintenance projects. The same ones Harold folded every week. He said the shape didn't move on its own. It didn't struggle. It didn't do anything at all. Greer didn't notice him at first. Harold stopped moving, part instinct and part shock, and watched the professor lean down and heave the bundled shape higher, as if preparing to carry it farther into the building. The detail that stayed with Harold the most was the way Greer kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the hallway like someone trying to gauge whether they were being watched. When he finally spotted Harold, he tensed. Not startled tense, like a man caught in a moment that demanded explanation but offered none. Harold said they held eye contact for just a second, long enough for Harold to understand what he wasn't supposed to see. He claimed Greer didn't speak, didn't yell, didn't try to reassure him. He simply stared. And for reasons Harold still didn't fully understand, he turned away. His instincts told him not to intervene, not to ask questions, not to approach. He was a custodian. Greer was faculty, and the university had a hierarchy that felt almost absolute. When he left the basement corridor that night, Harold convinced himself he had misunderstood what he saw. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe it was a mannequin, a training dummy, equipment for a study. There were dozens of explanations, each more comfortable than the last. By the time he reached the first floor, he had almost managed to believe one of them. But then rumors began the next morning. The missing student, the panic, the investigators. He heard Lena's name before he saw her photo, and the moment her face appeared on the television in the staff lounge, something inside him sank. He didn't come forward. He didn't tell his supervisor, or campus security, or the officers that canvassed the library. He said he kept the memory buried so deeply that he almost convinced himself it had been distorted. But every year that passed made the weight harder to bear. He described walking past the sealed corridor hundreds of times after that night, always feeling a sinking, choking tightness in his chest, like there was something behind that concrete wall he was refusing to acknowledge. The detectives asked why he waited 7 years. Harold lowered his eyes and pressed his fingers against his trembling mouth. He said he was afraid, not of Greer, but of losing everything: his job, his income, his reputation. The idea of accusing a respected professor felt unimaginable. And so he told himself it was safer to stay silent. But retirement changed that. With nothing left to lose, fear no longer offered protection. It only highlighted the damage he had done by saying nothing. When he finally finished, the room fell into a weighted silence. The detectives had heard fabricated confessions before, but this felt different. Every detail Harold shared matched the timeline, the geography, and the behavioral patterns of the night Lena disappeared. More importantly, it offered the first coherent explanation for how a student could enter a building on camera, never leave on camera, and vanish without a trace. They reopened the case that afternoon. Word of the development spread quietly through the department before reaching the university. Administrators tried to respond with caution, but the possibility that a faculty member had been involved in a long unsolved disappearance struck a nerve. Dr. Greer had retired 2 years earlier, citing health concerns. His departure had been quiet, almost uneventful, but the moment detectives arrived at his home with questions, the atmosphere shifted. Greer denied everything. He claimed he had never been near the sealed corridor that night. He said Harold must have been confused, mistaken, or inventing details. But the more he insisted he hadn't been in the basement, the more investigators noticed the tension in his voice. It didn't sound like a man being falsely accused. It sounded like a man trying to stay ahead of a story he never expected to resurface. For the first time in 7 years, Lena's case wasn't fading. It was accelerating. The detectives obtained search warrants. They combed through archival construction records, personnel files, maintenance logs, and anything that might support Harold's account. And as they dug deeper, the university's old blueprints revealed a detail that shocked even them. The sealed maintenance corridor had once connected to a sublevel no one had mentioned in years, a sublevel that had never been inspected after Lena disappeared. The detectives arranged for the concrete barrier to be drilled open, and as Harold stood behind the caution tape, his hands shaking the same way they did in the interview room, he whispered something no one expected to hear from a man known for silence. He said he wasn't sure what they were going to find, but he was certain of one thing. If he hadn't spoken now, it might have stayed hidden forever. And as the first chunk of concrete fell away, revealing a dark, untouched space beyond the wall, every person watching understood the same chilling truth. Whatever happened to Lena Hart? The answer had been waiting behind that sealed corridor the entire time. The story was no longer a legend whispered to freshmen. It was breathing again, and the darkness behind that wall felt less like an empty space and more like a secret that had been waiting to break open. The warrant came through just after sunrise, the kind of pale morning light that barely warms the pavement. Detectives didn't waste a second. After 7 years of stillness, hesitation felt like betrayal. They moved quickly, knowing the university administration would push back the moment they realized how deeply investigators were about to dig literally and figuratively into a place they insisted didn't exist. Within an hour, the team assembled behind the library, blending into a service area students rarely noticed. From the outside, nothing about the building hinted at secrets. Brick walls, metal doors, humming HVAC units, everything looked ordinary, maintained, predictable. But beneath the surface was the level Harold Finch had described, a place sealed before most of the current staff had even been hired. The kind of forgotten space that only a custodian on a lonely night shift would know how to find. Once the detectives forced entry, the air that escaped felt stale and stagnant, as if it had been waiting years for someone to pull it back into the world. The hidden corridor revealed itself 1 inch at a time as their flashlights cut through layers of dust. It was narrower than expected, lined with old pipes and rusted electrical conduits. The floor bore decades of neglect, peeling paint, cracked tiles, and stains whose origins no one wanted to consider. Each step echoed, the kind of hollow sound that only comes from long-abandoned places. For a moment, even the most seasoned investigators felt unease settle across the group. Some described it later as walking into time that had stopped. Others said it felt like entering a room that still remembered something it shouldn't. They moved deeper, taking methodical note of each doorway. Some doors hung crooked, hinges long eroded. Others were still sealed, their locks brittle but intact. The rooms behind them ranged from storage closets filled with broken desks to larger utility areas containing outdated electrical panels covered in warning stickers that had faded to near white. But none of these spaces matched what Harold described. Nothing yet suggested violence. Nothing yet resembled a hiding place for a missing student. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became, thick with dust and history. It was in the third branching corridor that the scent changed an almost imperceptible combination of mildew, metal, and something faintly organic, not fresh enough to raise alarms, but not old enough to be purely environmental. Investigators followed it, their flashlights settling on a cluster of forgotten personal items scattered near the wall. At first glance, they looked like things someone might have dropped by accident. A broken mechanical pencil, a torn note card with chemistry formulas, a keychain shaped like a small silver star. But then one detective stopped, crouched, and lifted something from the floor with gloved hands. It was a necklace, a thin chain with a tiny blue stone pendant. Lena Hart's mother had described it countless times. She had worn it every day since her 16th birthday and never lent it to anyone. A chill moved through the group, the kind of collective shudder investigators only feel when years of uncertainty suddenly crack open and spill real physical truth onto the floor. Finding the necklace changed the tone instantly. What had been a forgotten basement now became a verified crime scene. Evidence markers appeared, cameras clicked. Every scrap, every corner, every door took on a new weight. The air seemed heavier, as if the building itself knew that secrets were finally leaking out. Forensic techs followed the faint scent and the disturbed dust patterns, mapping out subtle drag marks along the floor, two faint lines that ran parallel for nearly 30 feet before disappearing near a row of old electrical cabinets. The spacing between the marks suggested someone pulling weight rather than carrying it, someone dragging a body. Detectives realized then why the scent had been strange. It was the residue of a moment long buried, diluted by time but not erased. Forensic teams scraped samples from the floor, though they warned immediately that the passage of years would complicate any results. Even degraded, even nearly invisible, the traces mattered. They were physical proof Lena had been here. A locked utility room sat at the very end of the corridor. Its door differed from the others, reinforced metal rather than thin industrial composite. Two padlocks secured it, both rusted but still functional. The university had denied this level existed, yet someone had clearly cared enough to ensure this particular room stayed sealed. When detectives cut the locks and forced the door open, the staleness of the air hit harder than before. It felt trapped, unwilling to move. Flashlights swept across a small, confined space cluttered with outdated equipment, empty shelving, and thick layers of dust. But on the floor, near the center of the room, the dust pattern changed. Instead of an even blanket, there were disruptions, scuffs, smears, faint circular shapes suggesting where knees or elbows might have pressed years earlier. Closer inspection revealed something else. Tiny, almost undetectable flakes of dried blood embedded into the cracks of the concrete. Not fresh, not obvious, but unmistakably human. Forensic experts confirmed within minutes that the blood was female. It would take days for DNA testing to confirm anything more definitive, but the implication didn't need explanation. This was where something had happened. This was where things had gone wrong. The room also contained a gray custodial blanket wadded into a corner. It matched Harold Finch's description perfectly. The color, the texture, even the faded laundry tag that identified it as property of campus facilities. Dust covered most of it, but when investigators lifted the edge, a few strands of dark hair were trapped in the fibers. The weight of the discovery settled over the detectives. After 7 years of dead ends, they now stood inside the last space Lena Hart had likely been alive. It was emotionally overwhelming, even for professionals accustomed to tragedy. An investigator in her 40s later admitted she stepped outside for air because the room felt like a grave that had been waiting too long. The question wasn't whether Lena had been there. The evidence made that undeniable. The question was, who had brought her down there and why? Suspicion quickly turned toward Dr. Marcus Greer, the faculty member Harold Finch had mentioned. Greer's employment file was pulled again, revealing a history of misconduct complaints that had been smoothed over with administrative language and internal warnings. None had been criminal, but the pattern was unsettling. Inappropriate comments toward students, unexplained access to restricted areas, disciplinary notes about overstepping authority with custodial staff. What had once been dismissed as minor concerns now looked like red flags. His access logs, though old and partially corrupted, confirmed he had used his credentials late at night on multiple occasions, sometimes in areas where faculty had no legitimate reason to be. Even more concerning, his access history included entries tied to maintenance corridors months before the library began renovating, suggesting he had known about and entered spaces thought sealed. Detectives requested immediate surveillance of Greer's home and notified campus police to monitor exits in case he attempted to flee. But when officers arrived at his residence for questioning, Greer was gone. His car was missing. His phone was turned off. Neighbors reported seeing him loading boxes into the trunk earlier that morning, but no one thought much of it. To them, he looked calm, purposeful, like a man preparing for a trip rather than someone running from a revived investigation. The manhunt began quietly but escalated quickly. Flyers circulated among local patrol units. Highway checkpoints near county lines were alerted. Greer's known associates were contacted, though none claimed to know his whereabouts. He had no close family nearby, no strong friendships. He had always been described as someone who kept to himself, neither liked nor disliked, simply tolerated by those who crossed his path. Detectives returned to the basement, searching for any overlooked detail that might explain motive. They found an old faculty ID card hidden behind a cabinet belonging to Greer, time-stamped from the year Lena disappeared. There was also a worn notebook containing maintenance codes, some accurate, some crossed out, which raised further suspicion that he had studied the layout of the hidden level long before anyone else realized what it contained. While forensic teams continued gathering evidence, detectives tried to reconstruct a possible timeline. How had Greer gotten Lena into the basement? Why had no one seen them together? Witness reports re-examined from 7 years earlier suddenly made more sense. A student had vaguely recalled seeing Lena speaking to a tall man in a dark jacket near the stairwell. Another thought they heard a muffled noise but assumed it was someone dropping books. At the time, none of these details had seemed meaningful, especially with inconsistent descriptions and unreliable late-night observations. But with Harold Finch's confession and the physical evidence in the basement, those small fragments took on new clarity. As word of the basement discovery leaked through informal channels, campus atmosphere shifted rapidly. Students whispered about the hidden level, speculating about how long it had been covered up and who else might have known. Lena's parents were notified privately, escorted through the restricted area only after investigators cleared the space. Her mother reportedly stood silently in the corridor for several minutes, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping Lena's necklace that detectives had recovered. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stared at the dust-covered floor as if hoping it would speak back. What unsettled investigators most was how close the truth had always been. The library had expanded, renovated, and modernized multiple times in the years since Lena vanished. Contractors had torn down walls, repainted floors, updated technology, but none had touched the sealed corridor. It had slipped through oversight like a forgotten artery beneath the building. The idea that renovation crews had operated mere feet away from evidence that could have changed everything years earlier weighed heavily on everyone involved. The manhunt for Dr. Greer intensified by the hour. Authorities tracked partial pings from an old credit card he attempted to use at a gas station off the interstate, but by the time officers arrived, he had already left. Surveillance cameras showed him wearing a hat pulled low, face partially obscured, but unmistakably him. He looked calm, almost indifferent, like a man who had accepted he could run only for so long. Despite forensic clarity, despite the momentum the case had gained, detectives knew one thing for certain: Greer wasn't running because he wanted freedom. He was running because he understood what had been found beneath the library, and he knew it was enough to close in on him. As the sun set over campus and investigators prepared to widen their search beyond state lines, one unsettling truth hovered over them all. Whatever happened next would decide whether Lena Hart's family finally received answers or whether the man responsible would vanish into the world just as Lena had 7 years earlier. And then, near midnight, a call came in that changed everything. The midnight phone call that reached detectives felt different from the dozens that had come before. There was no adrenaline in the dispatcher's voice, no urgency driven by pursuit or danger. Instead, there was a subdued steadiness, the tone of someone handling information too heavy to rush through. They were told an anonymous tip had been submitted to the department's online portal, flagged as high relevance to the active manhunt for Dr. Marcus Greer. It contained no threats, no demands, no attempt to negotiate, just a short message typed in a shaky, almost hesitant rhythm, paired with a location pin dropped behind the library grounds. The message read simply, "You won't find justice running after me. You'll find it where the truth is buried. Look behind the old electrical panel in the lowest maintenance shaft." And then a second line, "I never meant for any of it to go that far." Detectives who gathered around the screen experienced the same quiet tension, each understanding immediately what the message implied. Greer wasn't offering a confession. He wasn't revealing his whereabouts. He was pointing them to something he believed would speak for him, something hidden, something final. Within minutes, the team mobilized again, returning to the abandoned maintenance level with a heaviness in their steps, knowing they were no longer just searching for clues or answering lingering questions. They were walking back into a place that had already revealed so much, now expecting it to reveal even more. The basement felt different this time, as if the air itself sensed what was about to surface. Doors they had opened earlier seemed colder, shadows seemed heavier. Even the dust on the ground looked like it had shifted, as though the building had braced itself for the truth it had held onto for 7 long years. Flashlights guided the detectives through the narrow corridors, past the storage rooms and the space where Lena's necklace had been found, and toward the far end where the largest electrical panel stood bolted to the wall. The panel had looked unremarkable during their initial sweep, rusted at the corners, humming faintly with residual current, half covered by a blanket of dust. But now, with the anonymous tip replaying in their minds, the panel seemed less like a fixture and more like a barrier, a door disguised as infrastructure, a wall that someone wanted the world to forget. The forensic technicians began by disconnecting the building's auxiliary power, ensuring safety before removing the panel. It took several minutes of prying, unbolting, and cutting through corroded metal. Each groan of stressed screws and hinges echoed down the corridor like something waking up after years of forced silence. When the final bolt fell away, 2 detectives gripped the sides of the panel and pulled. The metal resisted at first, sticking to the frame as if reluctant to reveal what it was hiding. Then, suddenly, it gave way, swinging outward in a slow, weighted arc. Behind it was not wiring, not conduits, not anything a building inspector would expect. Behind it was a narrow maintenance shaft, pitch black, coated in layers of stale air, and large enough for a grown adult to squeeze through only if they angled their shoulders. A cold draft seeped out, carrying the faint smell of metal, dust, and something older. A ladder descended into darkness, its rungs thick with rust. No one spoke. Even the most experienced officers felt the shift in atmosphere, something settling over them with the weight of a confession made by a place instead of a person. A forensic tech clipped harness lines and lowered themselves first. Their flashlight beam disappeared downward for several seconds before a muffled voice echoed back up the shaft. "There's something here. You need to come down." One by one, detectives entered the opening, climbing slowly, listening to their breath bounce off the narrow walls. At the bottom, the shaft opened slightly into a tiny, unused service alcove, no larger than a walk-in closet. It was meant to house old water lines and emergency shutoff valves, but most of the equipment had been removed decades earlier. The floor, however, bore one detail that stopped every investigator in their tracks. A mound of disturbed dust formed a faint outline across the concrete, an uneven shape draped in years of settled debris. It didn't resemble trash or old equipment. It resembled the curve of a human form, packed underneath layers of time. A careful brushing of the top layer revealed fabric dark, weathered, textured like an old institutional uniform or student jacket. A gloved hand traced further, clearing the area with patient precision until bone became visible beneath the remnants of cloth. The remains were positioned awkwardly, knees slightly bent, arms drawn inward toward the torso in a posture that suggested the body had been placed rather than fallen. Detectives froze in the presence of the truth they had been chasing for 7 years. There was no doubt who this was. Not after everything else they had found. Not after the necklace. Not after the drag marks. Not after Harold's testimony. They had found Lena Hart. The room seemed to contract around them, suffocating with the weight of the moment. Grief moved through the group in a silent, respectful wave. Even officers hardened by decades of fieldwork felt their breath catch, some turning slightly away for a moment to gather themselves. 7 years of disappearance, rumors, false leads, and aching questions all culminating in this small, forgotten shaft beneath the library where she had last been seen alive. But recovering her remains was only part of the story. The detectives needed to understand what had happened, why she had ended up here, why Greer had gone to such extreme lengths to hide her. Documents recovered earlier provided fragments, witness interviews added implications. But the full picture emerged slowly as forensic analysts reconstructed the events with chilling clarity. Lena Hart had not been a random target. She had been one of several students who had privately expressed discomfort with Dr. Greer's behavior. Some had mentioned receiving unwanted attention during office hours. Others recalled conversations that lingered too long or veered uncomfortably personal. Lena, who was known for being direct and unwilling to tolerate boundary violations, had decided to confront him. According to a friend's journal found after her disappearance, she planned to shut down his behavior if it escalated again. Evidence suggested she approached him that night outside the library, perhaps asking him to stop speaking to younger students in ways that made them uncomfortable. What happened next was pieced together from the timeline Greer inadvertently left behind. He had access to the maintenance level. He knew it was hidden. He had a history of late-night, unaccounted movements, and he had been observed by Harold Finch carrying a heavy, blanketed shape into the corridor. Investigators concluded that Greer had lured Lena to the basement under the guise of showing her archival materials related to her study project, something she had in fact been working on. Once inside the lower level, where no cameras existed and no witnesses were likely to wander, their confrontation turned violent. Accounting for the patterns of blood found smeared on the utility room floor, the scuff marks near the shelving, and the indentations in the dust, a struggle had taken place. Lena had fought hard, the marks proved that, but Greer had overpowered her. Her death, though never seen directly in evidence, was undeniable from the aftermath. Greer, in a panic or perhaps with chilling calculation, wrapped her in the custodial blanket Harold had seen and dragged her through the basement corridors. The drag marks aligned perfectly with the path to the hidden shaft. He forced open the electrical panel, stuffed her body inside, descended, and hid her remains in the blind corner of a space no one would ever casually stumble upon. He then resealed the panel and resumed his life above ground, walking the same hallways where students passed unknowingly above Lena's unmarked grave. As detectives stood in the maintenance shaft, taking in the enormity of what had been concealed, the weight of institutional failure settled over them. This wasn't just the work of one man who had acted alone in the dark. This was the result of years of ignored complaints, administrative avoidance, buried reports, and quiet warnings that went unheeded. The university had failed Lena long before that night. Recovery of her remains took hours. Technicians worked with delicate care, lifting each fragment and preserving every thread of fabric. When Lena was finally brought back into the main corridor, a silent procession formed detectives, technicians, officers, each standing respectfully as her remains were carried past them. No ceremony was planned, but the moment felt ceremonial nonetheless. After 7 years, she was finally leaving the place where she had been abandoned. Her parents were notified before sunrise. They arrived privately, escorted by grief counselors, and walked the same path the detectives had taken hours earlier. No words could prepare them for seeing the space where their daughter had spent her last moments. Her mother placed a trembling hand on the cold wall beside the panel, whispering something only she could hear. Her father stood behind her, shoulders shaking silently. Closure is rarely gentle. In cases like these, it is a kind of pain that reshapes itself into gratitude only over time. News of Lena's recovery spread quickly once the department released a statement. Students gathered outside the library, leaving candles, notes, and flowers along the steps. Faculty issued public apologies. Protesters demanded accountability for the ignored complaints about Greer. Alumni questioned how a hidden level could exist on campus without anyone raising concern. The university scrambled to explain, citing old blueprints and outdated construction records, but the explanations only fueled public outrage. The truth had been buried, not just in concrete but in decades of institutional neglect. As for Greer, the manhunt continued for weeks, but he was never found. Some believed he fled the country. Others thought he might have taken his own life. The anonymous message that led detectives to the shaft was later confirmed through linguistic analysis to match Greer's writing style. But it was the last trace of him. He vanished in the same way Lena had, only his disappearance was one of choice, not tragedy. Despite the questions that remained about his fate, the case was officially closed. Lena Hart's remains were released to her family, who held a memorial service attended by hundreds. Her story, once a campus whisper, became a cautionary tale about vigilance, safety, and the responsibilities institutions hold over those who trust them. And for the detectives who had walked through 7 years of silence to reach this truth, one realization lingered long after the case files were archived. The answers they sought had never been far away. They had been hidden just a few feet beneath where students read, studied, laughed, and lived their lives buried behind steel, swallowed by neglect, waiting for the one person courageous enough to break the silence. Harold Finch, the janitor who carried guilt for 7 years, attended the memorial in the back row. He said nothing to the family, nothing to the reporters, nothing to the students who wondered who he was. He simply stood with his hands clasped, head bowed, knowing that although he had waited too long to speak, his words had finally returned Lena Hart to the world above. And in the end, it was the truth, quiet, buried, and patient, that shattered the silence and allowed her story to be told at last.